B.F. Skinner contends that man in his conceit refuses to accept what he really is, an organism shaped by his environment. In Dr. Skinner's controversial book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, he expresses the view that our individual and our cultural ills derive largely from the persistent and mistaken notion that there is in each of us an inner man who is somehow immune to environmental shaping, somehow ultimately free. Dr. Skinner denies the existence of this autonomous man and deplores what he calls the literature of freedom and dignity, which perpetuates the myth. Dr. Skinner sees each of us as wholly determined by our environment. It follows that to change our behavior, we must change and control our environment. The significant changes in human behavior, which most serious thinkers regard as necessary if man is to survive, can, in Skinner's view, only be effected through conscious, systematic control of the entire human environment, behavior modification, on a massive scale. Dr. Skinner's supporters claim he is the herald of a new constructive age. It has been called the era of conscious control. But his critics ask, who is to control the controllers? They argue that his views, leaving no room for basic human rights, are an open invitation for a new form of totalitarianism, and that his philosophy attacks the principles of human freedom and dignity on which our culture is based.
Because I'm not attacking freedom, I'm not attacking dignity, I'm not attacking anything on which a successful government could possibly be based. It's just, I'm talking about something beyond these things. I'm not for depriving people of freedom. I want them to feel free as much as they've ever felt free, and I'd like to have that, like to have them feel freer than they do now. Many of the people who reviewed my book have mentioned rats in mazes or dogs in dinner bells. That's what I was talking about. It's not. It's quite surprising to me now, looking back on it, how little the world in general knows about operant conditioning, and I would include many psychologists. It's an extremely advanced, rigorous science. There are hundreds of laboratories throughout the world that are doing this work.
Just how free is man?
If you simply say freedom is feeling free, when I can do what I want to do, I am free, and that was what people like Voltaire and Leibniz and others said in the literature of freedom, then you're stuck. Because that doesn't give you any preparation whatsoever for dealing with the kinds of control that people will exert by making you want to do what you want to do. And when you do it, you please them. That's what they have and what they're working for. And you are therefore vulnerable. And the literature of freedom has never properly taken into account the dangers inherent in the kind of control that works through volition rather than through punishment.
Then when I may feel free, but I'm still being controlled.
Absolutely. We're all controlled all the time. And that's one thing I think that we simply must recognize. And until we do, we're likely to worry about control. But you're controlling me, I'm controlling you. Parents control their children, the children control parents. Employers control workers, workers control employers. This is going on all the time. You're controlled by the physical environment you live in. You're controlled by the social environment. This is going on and has to be recognized as such. Now, the literatures of freedom do not prepare us to deal with very much of this. They're only concerned with the kinds of things you want to get away from. In other words, aversive control. Nobody objects to an environmental explanation of his bad behavior. The juvenile delinquent says, oh yes, I'm a crazy mixed up kid, that's what's wrong with me, I have a bad background, and so on. But everybody objects if you say the environment is responsible for your achievements, because you want credit for those. You don't want to be blamed, but you want to be praised. And these are reasonable things, and we can understand why this has been the case. But it's another example of how mixed up we are, really. We're all crazy mixed up people when it comes to why people behave as they do.
Why do we need behavior technology?
Well, if you're satisfied with the world the way it is now, I can't convince you that we do. I think we're making a mess of things, and these are all problems which have to do with behavior, not with physical or biological technology.
Now, suppose we want to set up behavioral technology. How do we choose the controllers?
The controllers choose themselves. Bear in mind that we're not talking about any totalitarian figure at the top who's going to run everything. We already have controllers. We have teachers. It's the responsibility of the teacher to take a certain number of students in his care for a certain amount of time and to arrange conditions under which they learn something. Now, the teacher of the future would have the same assignment. He'd be much better in working it out.
So the controllers of the future would be the controllers of today.
Absolutely, but they would control much more effectively.
Have you ever received a token or gold star for a job well done? Has anyone ever given you points or taken them away based on a behavior you displayed? The answer, of course, is most likely yes. Because whether at school, work, or in the home, behavioral shaping as outlined in operant conditioning has become a cornerstone in almost every aspect of human society throughout the world today. And while Dr. Skinner recognized that negative consequences can also be powerful mechanisms to shape human behavior, perhaps his key insight in 1938 was that punitive measures and threats often showed much poorer results than user-controlled reinforcement over a long period of time. Before Skinner began publishing, behaviorism had already progressed well beyond the Pavlovian laboratories, which first discovered that physical reflexes and behavioral responses could not only be programmed and replicated, but also that through the use of trauma, any previous behavioral programming, including one's own personality, could be wiped clean and replaced. Research into this darker side of programming and reprogramming individual behavior really took off after World War I, most especially in the newly formed Soviet Union, where Vladimir Lenin sought to standardize the population of Russia and gave Pavlov's laboratories every available resource to achieve this goal. Meanwhile, over in America, a young Edward Bernays was drawing upon his wartime experience in the somewhat freshly developed but world-changing new field of propaganda. By combining its outlining framework and his Uncle Sigmund Freud's most recent insights into mass psychology, Edward was able to link subconscious and emotional responses to products, people, and services with a legendary rate of success that would change the world forever. Not only did Bernays redefine the electoral process, but he also coined the term engineering consent and literally wrote the book on propaganda, as well as founded the very first public relations council in order to escape the stigma quickly attaching itself to the term. The short and somewhat recent history of man's exploration inward is infinitely fascinating. Throughout it, B.F. Skinner emerges as a singular figure in achievement. Operant conditioning was to many Darwinism's missing environmental link and science's new and most powerful tool for more successfully guiding this next step in human evolution.
If it's the case that we have what you call a technology of behavior, if that's to say it is possible effectively to get people to behave in this way or that, then surely there arises an enormous range of what are partly political, partly moral questions about through what institutions this sort of control is to be exercised, to what ends selected by whom, and all these are enormously difficult questions which are bound to get one into, I should have thought, political argument of a very fundamental kind.
I agree, it does, and I not only recognize, I have other people point them out again and again. This is the problem, and it is not, I think, the result of something being wrong in the formulation, but rather in the fact that survival is a very difficult value. How can one predict the exigencies to be encountered by a culture or a state or a political organization or an economic system? How can one prescribe the behaviors that are most effectively going to contend with these conditions? That's where the trouble comes, and that's why you have different political philosophies, different systems of economics, and so on. But that is nothing that I can do anything about. We are all in the same boat on that. We all have difficulties in deciding what is to be done, but if I have any expertise at all, I think it's in the field of how to do it after one decides.
Yes, yes.
Now, I think that raises the question as to what changes in a culture are desirable, and how is that question to be settled? Because you can't answer it in terms of the survival of that culture.
You can only answer it to the extent that you can predict some of the contingencies of survival which are to be met by the culture, and that's a very difficult thing. Survival is a very weak sort of value for predictive purposes, but we can still make some decisions. There are some kinds of things which simply must be changed now if we are to prevent disaster with overpopulation, using up of resources, pollution of the environment, and so on. We're not precisely sure how the culture would perish if we did nothing about this. We have a pretty good idea of the kinds of changes we need to make. We need to change practices which are continuing trends in certain directions.
By the time I was born, operant conditioning had already been a common household practice, whether in child rearing or animal training, for over 30 years. The Clean Air Act was achieving unprecedented levels of almost unanimous support. In the eyes of the world, we're focused on saving it. As I entered the school system, Professor Skinner's technological achievements in behavioral shaping had already changed not only how I would learn, but also how those who would teach me had been and are still being taught. Over this last half century, B.F. Skinner's work has helped reshape not just society, but humankind itself, transcending generations and playing a seldom recognized role in so many decisions we make. Its reflection can be seen clearly in every system where compliance comes with reward, where choices can be limited and paths modified through incentives, credit scores, or risk assessments outlining a preferred behavior. One such path is where our story now takes us, and it intersects directly with the road to consumerism, so painstakingly built by Bernays and many others, each on their own quest to leave a mark on this world. When we first started out on our journey, there was no way of knowing exactly who all we would meet along the way. And within this history we have explored together, there are so many almost forgotten people I feel like we have come to know. Now among them, I am slowly finding pieces of myself scattered throughout this reflection on the past, and beginning to notice my identity being shaped by people who are themselves products of an environment and time.